Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so, how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name's Jenny Mills, and I'm the Secretary for Education and Learning in the United Reformed Church. I'm nearing the end of my time as host, and I've had an amazing time. I hope listening has been as wondrous as me being able to offer to host the amazing guests that we've had on, sharing their wisdom and their experience with us. Each week, I'm joined, as you know, by a guest from a different place and space on the political and pulpit and political landscape. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Stephen Norrish. Stephen is director of Milton Keynes Christian Foundation, a local charity birthed from the ecumenical adventures in Milton Keynes, exploring and developing new approaches to mission and church through social enterprise. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that as we speak to Stephen. So it is with delight that I welcome Stephen Norris to be with us. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. So, politics in the pulpit. I wonder what that means to you. Could you give us a little bit about yourself and whether or not you see yourself as a pulpit politician?
Oh, goodness. Well, I seem to have spent most of my life trying to avoid pulpits. They were trying to present me as a reverend in the precursor to the show. So they wanted to make me Reverend Stephen Norris. Well, no, I've not achieved that status. And I think I've been trying to avoid pulpits for two reasons. One is a personal one, which is that I'm a PK, a preacher's kid, and there's something about trying to escape the paths that our parents have taken.
Yeah.
But also, one of the things that hit me when I took my first job was the sort of, it sounds silly now, but the discovery that God was at work as much in the community, as much in the world as he was in the church. And so I guess what I've been trying to work out for myself ever since then is how I make sense of what God is doing in the world and how I do my best to join that. And so pulpits are scary places for me because they feel a bit too churchy. But also they speak to me about power. It's interesting that we're meant to be talking about political power here, but the design of churches and the placement of pulpits is all about power. Somebody out the front, usually a little bit high and lifted out, and speaking down to the rows of people in the congregation. And if that isn't power imbalance, I don't know what is. So I've always had this bit of a desire to escape pulpits. I don't always manage it, but that's been what I've tried to do.
Okay, so if having avoided the formal pulpit setting in churches, could you just give us a bit of an idea about what your pulpit is and your context is in which you are at the moment, and then from that pull out some of the justice and political issues and events from the setting you're in. So how are you being living out your faith through what you do?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, director of the Christian Foundation, we're essentially a community, a faith-based community development charity working in Milton Keynes, and we try and find a way of being present within our local communities, to be listening, to finding out what's going on, to hear what the issues and challenges are, and to find ways of joining those and reflecting our understanding of the reign of God in those situations. And so at the moment, we're doing a lot of work with young people who are on the fringes of education. And so I guess in terms of politics and power, we're looking into issues around child poverty, family poverty, mental health, those issues that are affecting lots of young people at the moment. We're also, through our social enterprises, we've got this rather interesting way of doing work, which is that those young people help us and support us in wider elements of our mission through engaging in one of our 7 social enterprises. Lots of those enterprises are involved in looking at environmental issues, so how we treat our environment and how we live together on our planet. There's issues around food security. We've got a healthy eating community cafe. We've got an urban farm. We keep bees. We recycle bikes. So loads of stuff around how we live on our planet in a way that is mindful of the needs of everybody else. And those raise all sorts of issues in our political realm at the moment, and the way in which we treat others, and the way that we manage to live in a way that's sensitive to the needs of all those that are around us.
Thank you. I thank you so much. And I'm sure some of what you've already talked about will come into when we're looking at the text, sort of connecting the text that we read with the work that's going on. Thank you ever so much. So each week, my JPIT colleagues give me a little bit of a roundup, keeping an eye on the world. This week, we have that the NHS in England is facing the worst staffing crisis in history. Hospitals are struggling to maintain staffing levels, meaning trusts are finding it hard to tackle the COVID backlog. We've heard today 4 pro-democracy activists have been executed in Myanmar. 4 people held in prison have been killed, the first executions in Myanmar in decades. The US may declare a climate emergency. President Joe Biden is considering announcing a climate emergency to enable more powers to push climate policies up the agenda. This comes at the same time as wildfires destroy the large parts of California. We've also seen the UK with the most extreme temperatures ever recorded, and a number of fires going on last week and continuing to go on, including one within Milton Keynes last week. So there's quite a lot about climate crisis. And then we also have the ongoing situation with the Conservative government as they try to elect a new leader. So there's quite a lot going on in the world, and the church speaks into this world. And so with all of those things in our head and our Bibles in the other hand, we're going to look at this week's lectionary texts, and I open up. I invite you to kind of guide us, lead us through whatever you fancy doing through the text that we've been assigned for this week. So over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, we've been given some fairly meaty text this week. Yeah. And we could come at them from all sorts of different directions and pick up lots of the themes you've just mentioned. I think particularly the Luke passage, which I'll come to a little bit later on, and seems to me to pick up, you know, how do we deal with our abundance? But I'll come to that in a moment. I wanted to begin with Hosea, because you picked up at the end about the political situation and power and the way that our leaders lead.
Yeah.
And I thought the Hosea passage, strangely, was after I got scared when I first read it, thought that this was a really fascinating way to think about power, the way that power is exercised and how power is regulated.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's this amazing, I mean, Hosea does this all the time, gives us these amazing pictures of God, which seem to run counter to all of those things that we've been taught, all of those things we talk about in our liturgical discussions about God. And yeah, sort of really messes up those images, which is, I think, really good for us. So, you know, here God is this frustrated, angry parent with the child that is taking absolutely no notice of them. The more I called them, the more they went away from me. I mean, as a parent of teenagers, we'll all remember that sort of feeling. You know, but again, this goes on even further, because the idea given us is that the parent gets so frustrated with the child that the parent casts the child off and says, "I'm not going to have anything more to do with you." But the bit that really blew my socks off was the next bit, really, what happened next, because we have this picture of a God who is, so if I go back to the parent image again, and it's almost like turned their back on the child, started to walk away, angry, bitter about what's happened, yeah, and then suddenly pulls up short and stands still, and in the head is thinking, "My goodness, this is me. This isn't the way I am. I'm not like this. I'm, you know, I care. I love this child. I cannot go on with this way of acting." Yeah. So we've suddenly got this picture of God completely self-examining, looking within the God self and seeing that an action that is being considered is wrong, and completely turning around and going back the other way, and reminding God's self that God is of compassion and love and care. And, you know, those wonderful images we saw at the beginning. I really love the image of the child being lifted to the cheek. That's such a beautiful picture. But really turning this round, and as I say, bringing that back into the political realm and what's going on amongst our politicians at the moment. So one strand of thought that seemed to come to me straight away was this idea that, you know, that power, we've got this idea of power within our politicians, that we never do it. Politicians, we're not allowed to do anything wrong. There's clearly no self-reflection going on most of the time. And so we've got this incredibly warped view of what leadership and power looks like.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's quite a journey, isn't it? And I loved how you began at the beginning, because it's not the image of God we're given in the Old Testament, is it? We talk about this retributive God and all of this, and then those words, you know, I called him my son, I took them up in my arms, all of those things. And I thought I loved as well the for I'm God and no mortal. This idea that we personify God so much that we lose the mystery and the essence. Yeah,
maybe. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, the bit that I got from that was, it was almost you know, the sort of challenging us, saying, look, this is the way that mortals behave, and I don't behave like that. And saw that as being the thing there. And this this almost, it's so similar to the you know, God coming to his senses. Sorry about using the he there, but it's very difficult with the parent bit, isn't it? But God coming to God's senses, and you know, turning around. And I suppose I was left with the idea, you know, if God is self-critical, self-reflective, and that's what power, and that somehow power is about being able to be self-reflective and to change direction, how important then it is for us in our role as leaders, how important it is in terms of politics and power to have this element of self-reflection.
And it's interesting how there is that real tension, isn't there, of anger and love, and yet when the chips are down, God comes down on the side of mercy. There is this merciful God that just that offers us this compassion despite the behavior of the Israelites.
Yes. Yeah. I think
so. Maybe there's hope for some of our politicians yet. Then
careful.
So God never gives up on us at all.
Yeah, but I suppose one of the things that relating to our politicians is that there's something that we do as those who listen that don't allow politicians to get it wrong. They're responding to something that we are doing as the electorate, as listeners, that it's become unacceptable in public to accept that you've made a mistake and gone in the wrong direction.
Goodness, no, I'd not so it's almost they're responding to a perceived expectation, or an expectation that wrong is weak.
Yeah, making mistakes is weak, taking wrong directions is weak. All of the things that we know are really important for growth, for learning, and I think what this passage is telling us is actually it's a fundamental to power.
Yeah. So being able to self-reflect and being able to, and is it a bit like you know, where the woman challenges Jesus, and it almost feels like Jesus changes his mind.
Yeah. The Canaanite
do you see any?
No. That's what came to my mind, because again we see in Jesus the same thing. This ability to listen, to recognize that perhaps a particular direction is not the right one, and to change and to be influenced. So I exactly, there was the Canaanite woman came to my mind when I read the passage too.
Yeah. And I think there is it ties in with some of the repentance and some of the, you know, we do the prayers of confession, don't we? But this idea of it's okay to say you got it wrong, and then to turn and to change and to do something different. And it isn't prayers of confession often can be like, you know, beating yourself up in this individualistic stuff. But actually, if it were an acceptable way, we confess we've got it wrong, but actually instead of shame, we just see that as a natural part of life, and that's acceptable. That changes things, doesn't it? Changes the emphasis.
Yeah. We don't learn to walk but by falling over. So
yeah.
So
thank you for that. Thank
so
you.
That
Sorry.
That sort of led into me thinking about the Colossians stuff and the Paul gobbledygook, which Paul never sort of ceases to amaze me of how he can make something that is, I hope, is relatively simple, incredibly complex to read and understand. I'm going to get into trouble with Pauline scholars there, I know, but there we go. But what's really interesting is the beginning of the Colossians passage, picking up from how we had left Hosea, is asking us to get into the mind of God. Seek the things that are above, set your mind on the things that are above, the starting point in Colossians. So immediately Paul is saying to us, get yourself into the mind of God, where Hosea has just left us. See what's going on there. And as obviously for an activist, this is often an odd place to start a reading, an understanding of Paul, because there is this tendency, to be your head too stuck in heaven to be any earthly good view if you're not careful. But I think, as we'll go on to see in Colossians, that's not what this is about. This is about us getting ourselves into the mind of God, so that actually our behaviors, and then there's a list of very earthy behaviors that Paul is looking at, that our behaviors actually start to reflect what we discover is going on when we are poetically and imaginatively putting ourselves into the mind of God and what God is trying to do. So I guess what I would see in the Colossians passage connect to the other is a basis for self-reflection. Which is what I wanted to draw out of the Hosea one, and giving us a sort of a starting point for that self-reflection. So for the political activist, it seems to me there are two things to bear in mind here. One is, sort of picks up the sense of Paul in Corinthians in the wonderful love poem or hymn, which is that if we do these things without love, then they are nothing. And unless our political activism is rooted somehow in the imagination, the mind of God, then it could end with nothing. So for those of us that just want to get off and do something, which is often me, making sure that what I do is rooted in that sense is really important. So So, and I guess the other thing we'd want to just chuck in here somewhere is that this is not about hating sex or hating bodies, which some people use these passages from Ephesians and Colossians to do. So I wasn't going to go into that, but just to say it's not about that. This is a critique of sexual practices that are not rooted in love. And for me, that's the thing behind all of what Paul is doing, is if it's not rooted in love, then, it's nothing.
Now, thank you for that. I think that's really helpful, because the bit that I picked up was everything from verse 5 onwards. It's about relationships, and it's all about positive relationships and kind of grounded in the world we're in, because often we're encouraged, or we were encouraged to say, living well now gives you something when you die, and that whole sort of apocalyptic stuff. But actually it's about being grounded in the here and now. It's living God's way now, in good relationship with other people now. So I think that's really that's really helpful, that idea of and some of the other stuff is, some of that clothing yourself is an external, and actually it's coming back into the heart, isn't it, that Paul is usually calling us to, that what's with the heart, and that ties in with the love aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul is calling us into this sort of self-reflective practice and saying, look at what you're doing, look at how you're living, look at the way your community is living, your society is living. How does that look in the light of a God that commands us to love God and love neighbor? How does that look? How does it look when we look at it in the light of justice and community, which is what it's been called for? And there's that, as the bit you're pointing to towards the end, the breaking down of all ethnic, religious, cultural divisions. They all collapse in the light of God's love and in the light of God's community. But the bit that I suppose I was also keen to pick out of that, because it leads into the Luke passage, is that after that list of illicit sexual behaviours, the final one, and the one that Paul seems to give most emphasis to, is greed. And greed greed and love for neighbour just cannot coexist. And so it reminds you of the loving God or loving mammon, and that bit at the end of the verse, which is a form of idolatry, which you get, reminds us that we are constantly being asked by our faith, is it God that we love, or is it mammon we love? And that's really helpful to think about.
So it's that authenticity in life, isn't it? It's authentic living, so that you're that whole package. It's living well, looking at how you're living, reflecting, changing, challenging, but rooted in a love and relationship.
Yeah, rooted in the love of God and the grace of God, which we've been hearing about in Hosea and then at the beginning of Colossians. Okay,
so take us on to Luke then.
Greed
takes
packed,
us isn't it?
Yeah, greed takes us into Luke, doesn't it? What's really interesting is that Jesus is not interested in solving the problems of the rich. The passage starts with the son coming and saying, teacher, tell us how to do, what we're going to do with that. He's just not interested in the problems of the rich and the wealthy. Immediately, for those of us that even are relative wealthy, it's impossible to read Luke without feeling uncomfortable. It should be impossible for us to read Luke without feeling uncomfortable. Right at the beginning, he has filled the hungry with good things and sent. I'm going back before the text here.
Yeah.
Back to the Magnificat. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. And that theme is reiterated all through Luke. So Jesus is not interested at all in the problems of the wealthy. And it's in that context, I think, then we have to try and listen to the parable, which is about this rich, wealthy person who has got so much abundance that they need to knock down their old barns to build new barns. And for me, this is sort of some really helpful and provoking imagery that I think we could use in that would be the bit I'd want to use in the sermon alongside some of the other stuff, because what ultimately it seems to ask of us is, what do we do with abundance? What do we do with abundance individually, in our communities, and as a nation? So I mentioned sort of young people in poverty. Milton Keynes, we're supposed to be one of the wealthiest cities in the country. We look nationally, we're one of the wealthiest countries, sixth or seventh wealthiest country in the world, and yet 20% of our young people, and 20% of our young people and children, live in poverty. What are we doing with our abundance, and where's it going? So I think that demands lots of questions of us. And again, picking up what we were talking about in Colossians, the passage is essentially saying to us, are we using that abundance in the light of what we know about the love and compassion of God for us, and the compassion of love that is demanded of us, of our neighbour? And if, in terms of what I would then do with that, I don't know, are we okay to move on? Because in one sense, is that okay?
There you go. You've got the floor.
Have I? Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah. This is great. I love this. I think I'd be challenging. I'd want to say to the congregation, let's split into groups of 5, and ask ourselves, how can we build barns together that benefit everyone?
Wow.
How can we share resources in abundance rather than seek to possess them? And that takes me sort of really back into the sort of work that I feel as though I'm involved in, which is working in local communities, trying to hear and see the resources there and the creativity that's there, and to find ways of encouraging that to come together to solve some of the issues that are in our community. So this is how we might deal with some of the issues in our local community around food security amongst the needs of young people, and get people to begin to look at the abundance that's within their congregation and say, how might we build barns together with others that benefit everyone? And that felt like a really nice imaginative task to engage in, that might lead to things that we often see already in churches, but could lead to other. We know lots of churches are involved in food banks. I like food pantries more than food banks, as you know. I won't go into that now, but there is this idea that that's a really practical way of building a barn together, where we're sharing resources, we're sharing abundance, because a lot of it would be wasted. So we're sharing abundance.
Yeah, and I think for me that idea of the rich fool doesn't have any concept of anyone else. He is just quite individualistic, and it's all about him, and he's very focused, and you can't, it's really difficult. It's that difficulty, isn't it? Be sensible with what you've got, but equally, when does it become, it goes back to the serving God and mammon and all of those things. But this sense of we don't pick anything up in there about relationship with the other. And when you're talking, I think that idea of building the barns, what could we do? It's about not going, what can we do up here to help those poor people out there? It's actually, what can we do together that empowers and enables? And I think that's what Milton Keynes Christian Foundation is about, realizing potential, particularly in young people, isn't it? And it's about enabling those who've never been given opportunities to gain those opportunities. But it's also asking them to work together with the staff as well, isn't it? So everybody works on the social enterprises. And I think that idea of, again, comes back to relationship, again, comes back to working together. But that, how we do stuff so it isn't, goes back to the end of the Colossians, so it isn't an unequal relationship.
Yeah. Doing with rather than doing to.
Yeah.
No, that you're right. The parable is all I. And I think, as I say, that needs turning on its head to be how we can do these things together. And I think it's interesting. It's unfortunate the lectionary finishes where it finishes, and I understand that the next bit about the birds of the air and the lilies of the field actually isn't in the lectionary at any point at all. So, I'd be encouraging us to get that in somewhere, because what I saw in that was this notion of, rather than trying to possess the things of creation, but rather than trying to possess them, but to share them together, to share in the abundance of creation. So it takes us into lots of the environmental themes that you were mentioning earlier on, and the importance of living gently on the planet and sharing it in ways that maintain the lilies of the field and maintain the birds of the air, which, as we know, are struggling. The bees, as I would say, that's why we keep bees at the foundation, because the pollinators are in decline. So I think it would be good to bring that into the discussion, so that you can pick up some of the ways of sharing, that we, rather than trying to possess and own creation, that we are sharing in the resources, the abundance of creation together, and in a way that doesn't damage them. So yeah, pull in the next bit.
Yeah. And he also has this, I felt that idea of supply and demand. I'm going to hold on to this grain until the costs go up so much that I can get more money for it. And it feels a bit, with the petrol prices and all of this control and just the Russian and Ukrainian agreement over grain. This text just speaks into the world. It's so amazing, isn't it, how these texts literally speak into the issues that are already going on in our world.
Yeah, really challenging. How do we turn our ways of looking at resources from possession through to sharing? And I suppose where I would go, you mentioned right at the very beginning things like the National Health Service and other structures that we've got in this country, which we've put in place, as it were. These are barns that we've been building together for the future, and therefore we should be continuing to fight for them as churches and as Christians, because it's a way of us sharing the responsibility for our health. It's about sharing the responsibility for when things go wrong in our lives, and making sure that we're building barns and storing things, not just for ourselves, but for other peoples within our communities, within our society. So there's a lot of stuff around those collective approaches, those communal approaches to I want to keep on talking about building barns, because they are building barns. So that's why I wanted to ask the question. I said, so that's a real way that in a community sense we've done that. And then think about, how do we do that globally? That's more complex, but are there ways that we can build barns together so that we deal with, we've got things like the World Health Organization, which is another good example of that, United Nations, these things we should be supporting, because those are the bodies that are bringing together the abundance from our countries and then sharing them in those situations where life is more challenging. And as you indicated earlier, part of what's really important is that we might start with a charitable purpose, i.e. that there'll be times we need to give into situations, do things to a situation, but that should shift very quickly into seeing how we can do with people, things with people, and giving them the tools, the things that they need to empower them. I think you use the word to begin to have abundance in their own lives.
And this, is there something to it's when we're talking about the barn building, it's not just about practical action. Well, I suppose practical, but having your voice heard. The lobbying, the calling out the injustices. It's those things that are as vital as some of the provision stuff, isn't it? Or the offering space and offering opportunities. It is as well that enabling those who have no voice to actually be heard as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And I think, again, coming back to my sermon suggestion, I've been sort of saying to those groups, there are two ways. You might think of a practical project, but there might be a particular issue you want to put your shoulder to the wheel on and speak into that, and find ways of encouraging the communities that are facing the issues that come up to have a voice in those situations.
Right, so we've got a couple of minutes really, and so did you want to offer us some thoughts on the psalm, or are you quite happy that we've
No, I got a bit grumpy about the psalm, because it replaced the psalm that's in the Revised Common Lectionary, which is Psalm 49, which is all about the futility of gathering wealth. And so I'd be encouraging everybody to go back to Psalm 49. And a number of the commentaries on Luke suggest that it is Psalm 49, which is in Jesus's mind and heart, when he speaks so clearly about the folly of pursuing wealth. And in this particular parable, the fact that what is you've gathered all this stuff, and tonight I'm going to call you. You're going to die, basically. And the psalm picks up those same strands of the futility of that. So I decided that the psalm was optional, and then I was going to tell you to look at Psalm 49 when we got to this point.
well, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, with all of those things ringing in our ears, and thank you so much. It's been really good to take these texts apart with you and to see the threads that go through, particularly from a peace and justice angle. I really appreciate your wisdom and coming and giving us your time this morning. I've really, each time I do one of these, I just wish I could go on a bit longer. Do you know what I mean? Because I think there's just so much. But thanks for joining us and telling us actually that really we should be preaching politics. Politics with a small p should be preached in our churches and our pulpits, wherever we find them this week. And so I say to those who are listening that if they've enjoyed the Politics in the Pulpit podcast, could they leave us a review wherever they listen to the podcast? And if there are any questions that people would like to ask us or offer us responses to what's been said, we'd really appreciate it. The best place to join in the conversation is on Twitter @pulpit_politics, or using the hashtag Politics in the Pulpit. or on the Facebook community, which you can access through the Joint Public Issues team. The question, each week we ask a question, and I think I'm going to steal your question this week. You know, what does barn building, how can we build barns as communities and a society? And I don't think we can solve the issue in terms of the national and the global, but I do think we can start from where we are, looking at what justice and what equality is in our contexts. So we go into our politics and our pulpits with a blessing that I leave us with. May we be anointed with God's Spirit as we bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Stephen, thank you very much for having us, for joining us, and for coming on this morning. And goodbye.
Bye.